The buzzing precinct hummed with murmurs, clinking of coffee mugs, and periodic explosions of laughter. A new shift started and the officers prepared for yet another day of monotony in a sea of paperwork and trifling offenses. That was until the door to the station creaked open, swinging wide to reveal a visibly pregnant woman straining to step inside. She was dressed in a simple but clean dress, her hands protectively cradling her round belly. Her face showed traces of exhaustion, but her eyes held an unmistakable determination. Officer Brad Morris, a smug patrolman with an attitude of sarcasm in his wit, looked up from the desk and smiled. "Oh, look, fellas," he said loud enough for the room to hear, "a damsel in distress has wandered into our humble abode. Should we call social services or the maternity ward?" The woman walked to the counter, taking her time, as the jeering continued, and a loud burst of laughter filled the room. She leaned against the counter, took a deep breath, and spoke in a soft, trembling voice. "Excuse me," she said, "I have a complaint to file." "It's urgent." Brad raised an eyebrow and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "A complaint, huh? Let me guess. Baby daddy skipped town? Left you with a bill and a bun in the oven?" More laughter followed, but the woman's expression didn't falter. "No," she replied, locking eyes with him. "It's about a gang in my neighborhood. They've been threatening people, and last night they broke into my home." Brad rolled his eyes theatrically. "Right. And you're here because what? You think we're gonna march down there and play superhero? Lady, let me save you some time, we've got bigger fish to fry than some kids playing gangster." The woman's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the counter. "They're not kids," she said firmly. "And they're not playing. They're armed, and they've been terrorizing the block for weeks. I have witnesses, and I brought evidence." Brad turned to his partner, Officer Jenna Blake, who was trying and failing to stifle a laugh. "Oh, she's got evidence. Maybe we should call the commissioner," Brad said, playing it straight. "What's next? A PowerPoint presentation?" The woman's lips thinned. "Please," she said, quieter now but no less determined. "At least look at it. I'm not asking for much." Brad let out a melodramatic sigh and snatched the folder she slid across the counter. He flipped it open and skimmed the contents. His expression subtly changed with every word. Inside were detailed photographs of vandalized properties, notes about extortion demands, and even a grainy image of a well-known criminal brandishing a firearm. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, smugness gone from his tone. "I took them," she said simply. "I have been following their movements. I knew the police could never take it seriously unless I had proof." Brad's eyes narrowed. "So, now you're a spy? You realize how dangerous it is, right? Poking your nose in where you don't belong?" "It is my home," she answered. "And someone's got to stand up against them." Before Brad could respond, a commanding voice cut through the room. "What's going on here?" All heads turned as Captain Richard Monroe entered the room. A tall, imposing man with graying hair and a reputation for fairness, he surveyed the scene with a sharp eye. "This woman," Brad began, holding up the folder, "claims there's a gang terrorizing her neighborhood. She's got..." He hesitated. "She's got evidence." Monroe took the folder from him and flipped it over, his brow furrowed as he read. He looked at the woman, who was standing straight and unwavering under his scrutiny. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila Torres," she replied. Monroe nodded and handed the folder back to Brad. "Set up a formal report," he ordered. "And call Detective Carson. This needs a deeper look." Brad opened his mouth to protest but snapped it shut again at Monroe's icy glare. Grumbling under his breath, he began typing up the report. "Thank you, Captain," Lila said, relief washing over her face. Monroe gave her a small nod. "Well, look into this. In the meantime, I suggest you be careful. If these men are as dangerous as you say, they won't take kindly to being exposed." Lila's face darkened. "I can handle myself," she said. "But thank you for your concern." As she turned to leave, Brad couldn't resist one last jab. "Better hope your husband's not one of the gang members," he muttered. Lila paused and turned back, a faint smile playing on her lips. Oh, he's not, she said lightly. But he's someone you definitely don't want to mess with. The room fell silent as she walked out, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. Little did the officers know, Lila's husband was a man whose name alone could send shivers down the spines of the most hardened criminals. And soon, they were about to find out just how serious she had been. The precinct was electric with unease in the aftermath of Lila Torres' departure. Brad tried to break that tension once more with a joke, but this time nobody laughed. Captain Monroe's deadpan stare lingered on him a fraction of a second too long, silencing everybody. There was something to the way Lila spoke, quiet confidence in her voice, that made even cynical officers pause. Meanwhile, across town, Lila's neighborhood told a very different story. Dilapidated houses lined the streets, their walls marked with graffiti, territory markers from rival gangs. A gang known as the Black Vultures had recently claimed the area, intimidating residents and forcing them into submission with threats and violence. The community had tried reaching out for help, but their cries were met with apathy, until Lila decided enough was enough. She saw her neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, standing at her front porch, sweeping it with shaking hands. Her eyes darted to Lila as she practically ran down the stairs to meet her. "Did you go to the police?" Mrs. Alvarez asked hopefully and fearfully. "I did," Lila replied, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's arm. "They've taken my report. I gave them everything." Mrs. Alvarez glanced nervously at the street. "You shouldn't have done that, Mija. If the vultures find out, they'll—" Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Lila's eyes hardened. "They already broke into my home once. I'm not going to let them terrorize us anymore." Mrs. Alvarez shook her head. "But what can the police do? They never come here unless it's to take someone away." "This time will be different," Lila said firmly. "They have to take this seriously." But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, it became evident that the Black Vultures weren't about to let their authority be challenged. A group of them gathered in the middle of the street, their laughter and shouted threats echoing through the night. She watched from her window as they stood outside her townhouse. Her hand automatically rested upon her abdomen, involuntarily it seemed. She wasn't afraid hopefully for herself at all, but she needed to think fast. It was in the morning of the same morning that Captain Monroe reassigned Detective Carson onto the case. Carson did not talk much but believed in no-nonsense theory along with the fact that justice should be served. That said, Brad sauntered out to Carson's desk. "You're really going to waste time on this?" Brad asked, his tone skeptical. "It's probably just some petty squabble blown out of proportion." Carson didn't look up. "Did you actually read her report, or were you too busy cracking jokes?" Brad colored but kept quiet. Carson wasn't having it though, and he continued flipping through the photos Lila had provided. "This isn't some small neighborhood dispute. These guys are organized, and they're dangerous. If we don't shut them down now, it's only going to get worse." Brad shrugged. "Still seems like overkill to me. Let the gang unit handle it." Carson finally looked up, pinning Brad with an ice-cold stare. "You can sit this one out if you want. But if you're gonna keep running your mouth, at least try to be useful." Brad muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving Carson to his work. Later that afternoon, a police cruiser pulled up in front of Lila's house. She stepped outside to meet Detective Carson and his partner, Officer Rebecca Hayes, a sharp-witted and empathetic officer who had a reputation for connecting with victims. "Mrs. Torres," Carson said, extending his hand. "I'm Detective Carson. This is Officer Hayes. We're here to follow up on your report." "Thanks for coming," Lila said, shaking their hands. "Please come inside." Inside, Lila laid out everything she'd gathered: maps of the neighborhood with gang activity marked, a list of residents who had been threatened, and even a small notebook detailing the times and locations of the gang's meetings. Carson and Hayes exchanged a look of impressedness at her thoroughness. "This is amazing work," Hayes said. "But it's also incredibly dangerous. How did you get all this?" Lila hesitated, and then replied, "Let's just say I have had some experience in dealing with people like them." Carson furrowed his brow. What kind of experience? Before Lila could say anything, there was suddenly a loud knock at the door. The three of them froze. Lila's eyes darted to the window, and she saw a figure in a leather jacket standing on the porch. Her stomach coiled. "Stay here," Carson said, pulling his gun from its holster as Hayes followed him to approach the door. Carson opened the door far enough to see who it was, a wiry man, a black vulture with a scar running down his cheek, and sneering at Carson now. "Who the hell are you?" the man demanded. "Police," Carson said coolly. "What do you want?" The man's sneer faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Just here to talk to the lady of the house. Tell her to mind her own business if she knows what's good for her." "Is that a threat?" Hayes asked, stepping into view. The man held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just delivering a message. No need to get all official." Carson's face didn't change. "Consider your message delivered. Now get off this property before I arrest you for trespassing." The man gave him a glare, but eventually turned and walked away, his muttering growing quieter as he went. Carson closed the door and turned to Lila. "You're in more danger than I thought," he said grimly. "Well, post an officer outside your house tonight. But you need to be honest with us. Who exactly is your husband?" Lila's lips curved into a faint smile. "You'll find out soon enough," she said. "But trust me, I'll make sure we're all safe." As night began to fall, the black vultures started to reassemble. The leader, an enormous man named Razor, paced in their hideout, incensed at the audacity of Lilith's defiance. "We need to send a stronger message," he growled. "She thinks she can mess with us? Let's show her what happens to people who don't know their place." With this, the gang cheered in unison, getting ready to wreak havoc. Little did they know, the husband of Lila had also been planning his move, and it was a night they would never forget. That night, the atmosphere in the neighborhood took up an uncanny silence. The barking of dogs, the revving sound of engines, all seemed nothing more than a mere noisemaker. Lila quietly sat inside her home around the kitchen table with herbal tea mugged in both of her hands. Her inner voice replayed Detective Carson's warning, yet all that showed on her face was anything but fear. Her attention turned to the wall clock, as her husband was soon expected to show up. Meanwhile, a couple of blocks away, the black vultures were about to make their move. Razor stood in the middle of their hideout with his crew surrounding him. He pointed to a crude map of the neighborhood spread out on a table, his finger stabbing at Lilith's address. "She thinks she can mess with us?" Razor growled. "Time to teach her a lesson she won't forget." His crew cheered in agreement, their laughter cruel and sharp. They loaded their weapons, the metallic clicks and clatters echoing through the room. Razor's plan was clear: intimidate, destroy, and send a message to anyone else who dared defy them. Back at the precinct, Detective Carson couldn't shake a sense of unease. He sat at his desk, reviewing the evidence Lila had provided. Every new detail deepened his concern. These weren't small-time thugs. The black vultures were more organized and dangerous than had initially realized. And Lilith's calm confidence. It was as if she knew something he didn't. "Hey, Carson," Officer Hayes said, walking over with a steaming cup of coffee. "Still going through that report?" Carson nodded. "Something about this doesn't add up. She's too calm, too prepared. And when I asked about her husband..." He trailed off, his brow furrowed. "What about him?" Hayes asked, taking a sip of her coffee. "She wouldn't say who he was. Just told me we'd find out soon enough. I've got a feeling he's not your average guy." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You think he's involved with the gang?" Carson shook his head. "No. But I think he's someone who knows how to handle himself. And if he shows up tonight, things could get interesting." At precisely 9 p.m., a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop in front of Lilith's house. The car was immaculate, and the tinted windows shone brightly in the dim light from the streetlights. The driver's side door opened, and a man emerged. He was tall, with wide shoulders, and he was attired in a suit and tie that bespoke affluence and power. Every move he made seemed deliberate, each step exuding command. She opened the door before he could knock. A bright smile lit up her face at the sight of her husband. "You're just in time," she said, stepping aside to let him in. He leaned down and kissed her forehead before coming inside. "Are you all right?" he asked in his deep, even tone. "I'm fine," she said. "But they're planning something. I can feel it." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then it's time to send a message of our own." Razor and his crew arrived on Lila's street just after midnight. Their cars, beat-up sedans with blaring music and roaring engines, announced their presence long before they stepped out. The gang moved as a unit, swaggering down the street with weapons in hand. They expected fear, chaos, and compliance. What they weren't anticipating was the man in the middle of the road, waiting for them. The figure was backlit by the glow of a nearby street lamp. His suit seemed out of place in the rough neighborhood, but the way he stood, feet planted firmly, hands clasped behind his back, made it clear he wasn't intimidated. Razor stepped forward, his expression twisting into a sneer. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The man's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I'm the person you should have left alone." Razor laughed. It was a harsh, mocking sound. "Oh, yeah? And what are you gonna do, Mr. Fancy Suit? Call the cops?" The man's lips curved into a faint smile. "I don't need to call anyone." The man's hand moved into his pocket and produced a glossy black phone before Razor was even able to say anything. With the press of a button, he spoke into the phone. "It's time." In an instant, the street came alive with action. Black SUVs and unmarked cars appeared from nowhere, sealing off both ends of the street. Men in tactical gear tumbled out. Their actions were calm and synchronized. The black vultures froze. Bravado gone in a trice, they recognized that they were surrounded. "What the?" Razor stuttered, his eyes scanning around. The suited man took a step closer, his presence dominating the space. "You've made a mistake," he said quietly. "You came after my wife. Now you'll face the consequences." One of Razor's men raised a weapon, but before he could aim, a red laser dot appeared on his chest. A voice barked through a loudspeaker. "Drop your weapons! Hands on your heads!" The gang hesitated, but the sight of more lasers targeting them was enough to break their resolve. One by one, they dropped their guns and raised their hands, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion. Razor glared at the suited man. "Who are you?" he spat. The man's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "You can call me Mr. Torres. And you've just made the biggest mistake of your life." As the gang members were cuffed and loaded into waiting vehicles, Lila watched from her window, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. Her husband returned to the house, his expression softening as he saw her. "It's done," he said simply. She nodded, a wave of relief washing over her. "Thank you." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "No one threatens my family," he said. "Not now, not ever." News of the takedown of the black vultures created a ripple effect within the neighborhood like a shockwave. The next morning, people thronged the streets and began chattering wildly as neighbors, who for many months had lived in constant fear, began to go outside to breathe fresh air. Still, it was not the end of Lila and her husband's war. Inside their humble abode, Mr. Torres sat at the dining table as his phone buzzed with messages. He was just as commanding in appearance as the previous night, only he had swapped the suit for something far more casual. Lila set a cup of coffee in front of him and softly smiled. "What happens now?" she asked, sliding into the chair across from him. He took a sip, his dark eyes scanning the messages on his phone. "The arrests were just the beginning. Razor and his crew won't talk easily, but they're small time compared to the people funding them. This operation runs deeper than anyone realized." Lila frowned, her fingers drumming against the table. "And you're sure you're ready for that?" He set his phone down and met her gaze. "They made it personal when they came after you. I won't stop until every one of them is behind bars." Lila nodded, her resolve mirroring his. "Then I'll help however I can." Back at the precinct, Detective Carson was wrangling with the aftermath of the night's events. The black vultures were in custody. The expected grudgingness clung to Razor like a cold. Arms crossed and chin set, he sat stone-faced in the interrogation room as the detectives fired questions upon questions his way. Carson leaned back in his chair, studying the gang leader. "You're looking at serious time, Razor. Armed robbery, extortion, assault, the list goes on. Cooperate, and maybe we can work something out." Razor smirked. "You think I'm scared of prison? I've been running these streets since you were in diapers, cop. You've got nothing on me." Carson's lips twitched into a faint smile. "We'll see about that." Just as he was about to leave the room, the door opened, and Mr. Torres walked in, his expression unreadable. Carson hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let him take the lead. Razor's bravado faltered the moment he saw Torres. His eyes widened, and for the first time, he looked genuinely nervous. "You," he spat. "I should have known you were behind this." Torres took a seat across from him, his movements deliberate. "You should have left my wife alone," he said, his voice low and steady. "But now you've made it my business. And you're going to tell us everything." Razor leaned back, trying to regain his composure. "You don't scare me. You're just some suit with connections." Torres' smile was cold. "You're right. I have connections. Powerful ones. But you misunderstand me if you think I'm just a suit. I've dealt with men far more dangerous than you, Razor. And every single one of them underestimated me." The room went silent, the weight of Torres' words pressing in on Razor. Carson, leaning against the wall in the back, was impressed by how Torres commanded the room. "Hey Race, how this works," Torres said, continuing. "You talk, and maybe you get a lighter sentence. Stay silent, and I make sure you never see daylight again. Your choice." Razor's jaw clenched, and for a moment, it seemed he would resist. But then, his shoulders sagged, and he let out a bitter laugh. "Fine. I'll talk. But you're not gonna like what you hear." Over the course of the next few hours, Razor spilled secrets that unraveled a network of crime and corruption far beyond the black vultures. He spoke of names, locations, and operations. A whole underground empire infiltrating numerous neighborhoods was what that information boiled down to. The information was a goldmine, and Carson knew it would take weeks, if not months, to dismantle it all. Back at home, Lila's phone buzzed with a message from her husband. "It's done. I'll be home soon." She smiled, relief washing over her. But as she set the phone down, a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Detective Hayes standing on the porch, looking slightly sheepish. "Detective Hayes," Lila greeted. "What brings you here?" Hayes hesitated before answering. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything you did. If it weren't for your courage, we wouldn't have made this much progress." Lila smiled warmly. "I didn't do it alone. But thank you for saying that." Hayes nodded and turned to leave but paused. "By the way, your husband. He's not exactly what I expected." Lila chuckled. "He has that effect on people." As Hayes turned and walked away, Lila stepped inside the apartment and leaned against the closed door, her palm falling to rest on her stomach. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in months, she felt safe. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood began to change. With the black vultures taken down and their network exposed, peace slowly crept in. Residents began taking back their streets, organizing community cleanups and events. Lila became a quiet hero among her neighbors, though she never sought recognition for her role. Mr. Torres, true to his word, remained involved in the cleanup efforts, using his resources to ensure safety and stability in the area. He remained a figure of quiet strength, his presence a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope and resilience could prevail. The sun set over the by now peaceful neighborhood, where children were playing in the street. Lila and her husband stood on the porch of their house. She leaned against him, her head against his shoulder. "We did it," she said quietly. "You did," he replied, planting one soft kiss on her forehead. "You were that fire that kept everything lit. Just remember that." Lila smiled, feeling her heart full. The way forward would still be bumpy, But together, they were unstoppable.